ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School Grade 1. This is the final class in Grade 1 and it is exam feedback today. I do hope that you've had a chance to have a bash at this on your own. As I've been saying throughout the course, this is a difficult and dense course, and the more productive and involved you can be as a student, the better in terms of assimilating and being able to apply this material at the tables. So without any further ado, let's get into the results and we'll see how you did. We're going to do things a little bit differently today. For each question, we're actually going to be bringing up a pre-solved sim and explaining why the solver recommends what it does. I'll be explaining not just why, but also how this ties into the theoretical discussion that we've been having so far and how some of the grade 1 material is going to be demonstrated in the solver output, while also giving you a very concrete answer and proving to you that objectively in game theory, these answers are the case. They're not just my opinion, but I will explain why the solver holds the opinion that it does. So let's start with question 1, which asks us to estimate EV on a double barrel opportunity node, button versus big blind. This is about understanding the EV can be expressed as a percentage of the pot that needn't be limited to 100. Equity cannot be more than 100%. You can never win a hand more than 100% of the time, but remember that you can be entitled to more than 100% of something in absolute value. Just like you could get 200% of your investment back, you could be entitled to 100 and whatever percent, 200, 300% of this pot ostensibly. So very good hands here are going to be entitled to more than the pot, and then the weaker hands obviously less than the pot. And your job is not to try and nail an exact percentage here. That would be impractical and highly unuseful in game to try to be that precise. Rather, we want to be within 10, 15% to start with and just get more and more accurate as you do this. I would say that while this question can be very daunting at first, the better you get at estimating equity and EV in a percentage like this, the more intuitive in-game decision making becomes, and so it's very worth it to actually try these exercises. I'd urge you in your own study to do something like this too, to try and estimate the equity of hands as you go. So let's start with ace 10 of spades here, obviously an incredibly strong hand, and I'll show you what the solver thinks about this and why. What we've done here is simply selected strategy plus EV in Pile Solver here, and it's brought up the EV of our hands here. If we want to actually have it color code things by how strong the hands are, just for easy EV viewing, we can even click this EV in position button here. Note that I've navigated to the right node in the tree, where in position has a chance to barrel the turn. So starting with ace 10 of spades, we can see that this hand has 143% pot. I would accept anything between like 130 and 160 here. When percentages get this big in terms of pot share EV, it's definitely okay to not know exactly how high this is, but just to have an idea that you're going to be getting back considerably more than the pot. But because we're on the turn and we're already in a situation where the pot is quite large, the flop has been bet, remember, you're not on average going to get like 300% of the pot here. This is more something that would occur on the flop when the pot is much smaller. So generally as a rule, the smaller the SPR, the less chips that are remaining compared to the pot size, the lower the ceiling on how high these more than pot EVs can become. Okay, having a look at Queen 9 now, which is hand B. We can find this hand here. We can see that on average Queen 9 has an EV of between 25 and 26% pot. So this is possibly counterintuitive if you're just counting outs. If you're falling victim to the don't have the odds fallacy in certain spots, you might just be looking at how often you can improve, which is not a bad thing to do when you first start playing the game and you need to get a feel for how often your hand can outdraw certain hands. But equity and EV are of course much more than that. This hand in position will realize its equity very frequently. It's infrequent that you're going to get raised here after you bet. It's going to happen a small percentage of the time. We can see here only 6% of the time, because villain would be repolarizing there. It's not a common spot as we've seen for raising. So you're going to realize a lot of your equity, which is going to help EV. You have position, which is going to help EV. And you have more than just 4 outs here. You don't want to see this as a 4 out hand, i.e. 8% by the rule of 2. That would be doing it an injustice. This hand is much stronger because it can hit a pair as well. This is a very relevant pair draw against anything that's not trips, because the 9 or the queen is oftentimes going to be live against villains. Mediocre hands, not against this 10x, but against the mediocre stuff. And 10x will of course have raised us on the flop at a fair frequency. So it's one thing we shouldn't say here is that the EV is higher because of fold equity. This doesn't actually make sense, because turn double barrel and triple barrel, while they're reasonable worlds for our range, our opponent has already done his or her overfolding relative to the math, the MDF on the flop. So that's the point in the hand where villain is going to shed that range disadvantage, not on the turn. So when we bet the turn, we're going to see that the fold equity is around where it's supposed to be for the break-even point if we had absolutely zero equity. And therefore what we don't want to say is that the EV of Queen 9 is higher than its equity, or is surprisingly high perhaps, because of fold equity. Yes, there's fold equity, but no, you don't get that for free. You know, your opponent doesn't just say, oh, hey, I'm just going to fold my hand. You don't have to risk anything when I'm winning, but I'm just going to fold my hand for free and tell you that I have nothing. Only very, very bad poker players are going to do that. Therefore, we have to pay for the fold equity, and it doesn't come for free. Therefore, the fold equity when we get it is good, but we lose a lot of money the times we don't get it, when we bet and get called here on the turn or the turn and the river. And therefore, we need to see the fold equity here as kind of a moot point. We can't see it as a source of our EV because we don't get above and beyond what we would need for that to actually be a break-even proposition. We just get a break-even amount of fold equity here. So that's important to note, that it's implied odds, position, pair draw and straight draw equity that adds up to this 25% pot, which is admittedly more than you might think at first glance. Pocket aces, ace of clubs, ace of hearts to be precise. How's this hand doing? So this one is coming in at almost full pot. Against opponents who don't slow play a 10 enough here, this hand will be even better. So if you thought this hand was like 100 and something percent pot, you might be used to people not slow playing a 10 as much as they're meant to. If we go back to the flop here and just glance at villain strategy, you'll see that the 10x, while it raises a lot, it also calls a lot of the time as well, right? You're not seeing 10x pure raise, like nowhere near. Quite a lot of call in there, as you can see. So again, just to bring up this view, pocket aces is a powerhouse hand. If we look at its equity, actually, we'll see that the equity is 81%, so it is indeed reaping more of the pot in EV than its equity, EV coming in at 93, 94% of the pot. But no, it's not like a powerhouse hand like ace 10, because there's a huge difference between a hand that beats every 10x and a hand that doesn't beat any 10x. And then finally, hand D is going to be the ace queen of diamonds. So the first thing you should note about this hand is that it does have a lot of showdown value. So this is the sort of opposite thing to the Queen 9. The Queen 9 was garnering most of its EV from improvement and implied odds, whereas this hand, it does have some implied odds, but no, it's not really going to be doing a lot of betting on this node. If we look at the strategy for this hand, it's pretty often going to check it. It can bet again here as a sort of hybrid bet, and we'll discuss hands like this that look like showdown value that are actually betting a bit more in grade 2 of the Carrot Poker School. But a lot of the time this hand will derive its EV from just checking behind, going to the river and showing down and winning. The pair draws that this hand has are also very strong, and this is perhaps why ace queen has again more EV than you might expect. You might not think this hand would be entitled to 30% of the pot here, but yeah, it's doing rather well for an unpaired hand after villain has strengthened their range by calling us on the flop. So hopefully those answers make sense to you. I hope there's a bit of synergy there between what I'm saying, what the solver is saying, and your understanding of the course so far. Without any further ado, let's move on to question number 2. So in this spot, we are the hijack, slightly tighter opening range than before. We go ahead and open in c-bet king 8-7 at high frequency. We're going to be betting this board. The ace of hearts comes in the turn, admittedly a very good card for our range because villain is going to be folding not all, but plenty of their ace-x combos on this particular flop. This wouldn't be so much the case on some low innocuous board like deuce 3. So the question asks you for each of the following hands. In the spirit of lecture 2, try to estimate whether they are optional, prohibited or mandatory value bets, and assume that the only sizing available to you is B75. I think it wouldn't be ridiculous to have overbets in your strategy here in game, but just for your benefit for now, to simplify the game tree at grade 1 level, we're going to just use B75. There's not an EV loss associated with sizing down here theoretically, so this is fine. So the first hand we're going to look at here is the king 9 of hearts. And king 9 of hearts is indeed a hand that you cannot value bet. This hand is too mediocre. Betting for 75% pot here would be to reopen the action in a situation where reopening the action is just not giving you any upside. If we look at the equity of this hand, for example, and put on the equity display here, we can see that this hand comes in at 63% equity. One important trick here is that when you first look at EV here, or equity for that matter, you might look at the entire combo and be like, oh, king 9 of hearts is 66. This is not correct. This is all of the king 9. And the king 9 of spades is, of course, bringing up the average equity for king 9 by having a flush draw. So king 9 of hearts is 63%. Pio's nice enough to give you a color that really helps you decide how strong a hand is. And this sort of mostly yellow, lime, greeny type color that king 9 gets here is going to render this hand very mediocre. It's going to describe a mediocre hand, and this is, of course, what you have. betting the middle of your range on the turn, reopening the action by doing so in position, is a procedural mistake. It's a very big protocol error called a polarization error. And if we were to look at the EV difference here between betting and checking, we can see that it's fairly slight. It's only like 1% pot or something like that, but we should note that doing this in the long term is also going to build a kind of absurd strategy where you just have way too many medium strength hands in your betting range, and it will encourage your opponent to start raising at a much higher frequency. So there are some small downsides to betting this hand in equilibrium in a vacuum, but if you do it long term, then the downsides are much more. So definitely not a thing that you want to start doing. You want to recognize this hand as squarely a mediocre hand and go from there. The second hand for question 2, hand B, is the ace-jack of spades. So we have top pair here with a flush draw. What did you think about this one? Well, the thing about ace-jack of spades is that it's an incredibly powerful value betting candidate. You can see here that our solver is happy to value bet this hand at some frequency, quite a high frequency in fact. This is not, according to the solver, a completely mandatory value bet. And one of the issues with this hand is that the ace is just going to remove ace-x from the deck, which is going to make it a bit harder to get called. If you could somehow have an overpair to the ace that also had a flush draw, which you can't have here, but that would be amazing, then you'd get to unblock the ace. But of course, that's an impossibility. So yeah, this hand is not actually completely mandatory to value bet, but you do probably want to always value bet a hand such as this against weaker opposition who are stationary with king x that are going to call down too often, or even against people who aren't going to bluff the river. A lot of your EV here from checking back this hand comes from times that people bluff the river and understanding that they actually have to bluff certain missed gutters and things like this on the river here, and even some busted flush draws. So if you're against someone that's very passive here, I think you just always want to bet this hand. So if your instinct was must value bet, I totally sympathize with that position. I see why, and I think against many real life opponents that would be correct. However, against a properly constructing GTO opponent, you would be indifferent between betting and checking with a hand like this. Your hand needs to be a bit bigger here in order to be fully in the bet camp. The next hand we're going to look at is pocket sevens, which is a set. Needless to say, sets are amazingly strong hands, and when you have an amazingly strong hand in position, you're going to see that the solver is now not indifferent anymore between betting and checking. It is just going to be betting these hands all of the time. The idea with a set here is just that the hand is too powerful and needs to derive its EV from urgent pot growth, and it wants to reach that investment ceiling, which is a very high investment ceiling, and it wants to reach that as soon as possible in order to set up a big pot for betting the river, right? It wants to make progress towards that high investment ceiling right away. So sevens mandatory value bet. I think in practice even more so. You can go wrong very badly against passive stationary players here by checking this hand, so not really a spot you want to be slow playing without some fairly bizarre read that, to be honest, I don't think we ever really have. Like villain is overfolding turn but going crazy on the river, turning showdown value into bluffs. It would need to be something like that, something quite far-fetched. Hand D is the ace-10, so obviously if ace-jack was not a mandatory value bet, then neither is this. We've only had one mandatory bet so far, one optional and one prohibited one. What do you think about ace-10? Well, this hand is weaker than ace-jack, obviously, and doesn't have a flush draw. That said, it's still clearly good enough to value bet if you're not able to value bet a turned top pair, which is actually higher equity in EV than a flop top pair because your opponent filters away from that card, not towards it, by continuing on flop only when that card is present on turn, not flop. Hopefully that makes sense. If it's a flop top pair, villain filters towards it by calling the flop. So the ace-10 off here in general is just going to be coming in as a frequent value bet. It's quite interesting that this hand is actually betting more often than the ace-jack. I would not call this hand a mandatory value bet, although it is close, but the EV difference is nothing between betting and checking in some of the combos here, depending on suit or checking. What it seems here is that when the hand doesn't have a spade, it's actually more of a mandatory value bet, especially when it doesn't have the ace of spades, because it's unblocking weaker hands that are quite high equity that are useful to value bet against. So when you have a hand like ace of clubs, 10 of hearts here, the solver says you should always bet, and that's because the ace of spades in your opponent's range is unblocked and calling a pair plus draw, a hand that you're doing well against and want to get money into the pot 3 times against, ostensibly. So interesting here that the ace-jack of spades is not betting as often as the ace-10 off, despite the fact that it's a higher equity hand. This sort of flies in the face of what we've been learning, but you know, the exception often proves the rule in poker, and the exception here is that the ace-jack just has way more blockers to villain's continuing range that we want to get value from than the ace-10 does. and also benefits less from fold equity than the ace-10 does. So that's kind of interesting how denial does play a role there. So when you're looking at what your mandatory value bets are, they're generally things like the top 2 pair that unblocks the weaker 2 pair and stuff like that. When you have ace-king and you unblock a7 and ace-8, it's very important to bet, but when you have 7s, it's actually less of an EV swing. So almost paradoxically here again, we see that ace-king is more of an urgent value bet than 7s, even though 7s is a slightly higher equity and higher EV hand. It's interesting. So question 3, queen 4-4, two-tone, 7 turn 3 river. Big blind here has taken the trademark line of calling flop and being faced with a turn check. When the button player c-bets the flop and checks back on the turn, their range is going to be considerably weakened, and big blind is actually going to arrive on this river node with a range advantage. That range advantage is going to mean that big blind has to bluff with certain calibers of hands, so this question asks you, for the following hands, assign a label out of cannot bluff, optional to bluff, and must bluff, just in the spirit of lecture 3. And we want to do this by thinking about range advantage first and then thinking about hand. So with Jack 9 of hearts, let's take a look at what the solver thinks about the necessity with which you have to bluff this hand. Here we have our Jack 9 of hearts, and we can see on this run out that this hand is a completely mandatory bluff. The reason we don't have this hand very often is twofold. One, we're going to raise it on the flop sometimes, and we're going to 3-bet it pre-flop a lot of the time in a button versus big blind node on these sims as well. That'll vary a little bit depending on your inputs, but we can see that when we do have this hand, there's a sliver of Jack 9 of hearts there, and it is going to be losing about 10% of the pot if it doesn't bet. Surprisingly, this hand does have some showdown value. It shows down at 4% of the pot, but we have to remember that in a favourable world for our range, and this is incredibly good for range because our range has 58% EV on this node, that's much more of the pot than our opponent's 42%, needless to say, so our Jack 9 is going to be reaping way more fold equity for this B33 than you would expect, or that would be the case in a neutral environment, and we're getting 40% instead of 25%. Now, that extra 15% fold equity is something we're going to move on to call river blunder theorem in GTO in grade 2, and the idea with the river blunder theorem is that it's actually a big blunder to not bluff a hand that has minimal showdown value on a very favourable node for range on the river. I'm going to cover that in grade 2, lecture 2. Have to bluff this one. If you're not bluffing this one, if you're going straight to blockers, then you're falling into that incomplete thought process trap where you're using blockers as a sufficient reason for something. Yes, you don't have a club here, but no, that doesn't really matter. It's not super important to have a club on a node where your opponent has checked back the turn and where you have a massive range advantage. You just need to be understanding the range versus range matchup and the low showdown value of your hand, and that will lead you to finding a bet here. You don't want to be going straight to blockers and obsessing that you could have a hand with a club in it. That's not important here. Hand B is the King 10 with the 10 of clubs, so the most obvious and striking thing about this hand is that it just has more showdown value than the previous one. But let's take a look at whether this is actually going to be enough to make it a check. So we go to King 10 here, we see that the hand is still a bet and it's mandatory, but we do see that the EV difference is now closer. You're no longer throwing away 10 to 15% of the pot by not bluffing, because the hand shows down for so much more EV now. The EV difference between betting and checking is only about 1% of the pot, but that's still going to be relevant enough to add up in the long term. And again, the really striking point here that you want to double underline and highlight is that even hands with showdown value are mandatory bluffs in favourable worlds for your range, like very favourable worlds like this. 58% pot share. EV for your range, as we see here, is very high. So another mandatory bluff. We've got 2 mandatory bluffs out of 2 so far, so I hope you guys had the same answers there. If you didn't, this is a very important point. I would pause at this juncture and just make sure that you understand why both of these hands are being bluffed full frequency and why the solver deems it a mistake to check either of these hands on the river in such a node. If you don't understand that, you're going to make so many mistakes in practice, and your red line, that's your non-showdown winnings tracking line, is going to be plummeting, like jumping off of a cliff kind of plummeting. So just be careful there. Make sure you know where you have to bluff the river in poker. It's very important. Hand C is pocket fives. Now we're obviously moving right up the showdown value ladder. What does the solver think about fives? Unsurprisingly, this hand has way too much showdown value now to be betting, meaning that the EV of betting is just way inferior to the EV of checking with a hand like fives. Not because betting isn't good objectively if you were comparing it to 0, which would be a silly comparison, but if you were comparing betting to folding here, it would be like much better to bet, of course, than to just open fold your hand, which would be 0 EV, but it's better to check. depending on your suits a little bit here, you're going to be showing up with 1 to 2% more of the pot by checking than by betting here. Betting is a weird thing to do. You can occasionally, I think, get called by worse. I think you can occasionally fold out better, but by and large, you're just going to be investing money, mainly to get folds from worse hands and calls from better ones. So that's why we don't want to be value betting this hand. I guess if you were to use a small sizing, the hand is closer to a value bet than a bluff, and if you were to use a big sizing, it's probably like somewhere in the middle, but betting here just wouldn't be correct with fives. This is a prohibited bluff. You cannot bluff with this holding. And finally, hand D is ace 10 with the 10 of clubs. So the first thing that might grab your attention about this hand is the usefulness or apparent usefulness of the blocker. And when we look at ace 10 opposite combos, though, we see that we're again just too high up in our range. Our hand is showing down for so much of the pot here that bluffing would be a waste of how good checking is. One interesting thing we see from the EVs here in the solver is that these numbers tend to go down as our bet size increases. You see that? They're kind of inverted there from the top down. They're getting bigger. And that's because this hand is closer to a value bet than a bluff. It's quite interesting, right? You might think of this hand as a bluff candidate, but actually if you bet 33% of the pot, it's actually almost a value bet. You're going to be getting called by a few weaker hands. It's not good enough to value bet, and betting is a mistake here, but it's miles away from a bluff. And if you bet big with this hand, there are a few problems with it. One, you've just said no thanks to a very profitable line in checking. Secondly, you're going to be making villain fold hands that are just worse than yours for the most part. And thirdly, you're going to actually block the folding range and unblock some of the pairs that villain has here as well. So I really don't think betting here makes any sense, and is quite a big mistake. So definitely a cannot bluff situation again. Moving on to question 4. So in this situation, we have a few different questions to answer. These ones are a little bit more wordy and theoretical rather than just looking up numbers in a solver. So small blind here, c-bets ace 10 for, big blind calls, small blind then overbets the turn for 150% pot, and big blind calls again, and then small blind has the opportunity to fire the triple barrel on the river. So question A asks you, what is the difference in shape between small blind's range and big blind's range here on the river? We can look at the sim for some of this, but I think question A is answerable just by saying that the small blind range is incredibly polarized and the big blind range is incredibly condensed. That's really all you have to say, but I will show you in the solver, since we have the sim to hand, just what that looks like. I think one of the best displays to really hammer home the point here is probably this EV color display. Once again, if we look at the out of position range that arrives on the river here, and I haven't actually given this sim B150, but we do have B200. But before doing anything, you can just see the inherent polarization of this range. There's a lot of incredibly nutted hands in here, 4s, 10s, ace 10. These hands now make up a very large percentage of this range because of the filtering action sequence. When you polarize your range multiple times like this by betting big on multiple streets, what really happens is that the nut prevalence of your range increases and you gain a massive nut advantage for the reason that you're going to have these nutted combos way more often than your opponent is. So you're going to be seeing a lot of green and red here. The bluffs have very little showdown value in EV. You see them around here, just kind of entitled to very small red color here amounts of the pot, and then the value hands in dark green. There are a few mediocre hands here too that have decided to bet turn and will now be in a weird spot where their equity is going to be high but not high enough to jam, but they may still be able to value bet. So what you're probably going to see mostly in GTO in spots like this is solvers actually adopting two sizes on the river, a block bet as you can see, and then a jam as you can see here. And I think you could play this jam a bit more often as well with the amount of value hands you have here in reality if you want to. I don't think protecting the small bet range with really nutted hands is that important on a node like this. So what we see after the bet is an even more polarized range here. If we look at strategy, the hands that actually jam are incredibly polarized. We just have certain bluffs and then certain value hands that unblock the calls, mostly like pocket fours doing this. I think you could do this wider in reality if you wanted to with these nutted hands, because the block bet's kind of assuming your opponent will raise you sometimes. But anyway, the main difference is if we go back to the other player's range there, landing on the river, and we look at the EV of the in-position player, we see it's way more of a mixed bag. While there are still some nutted hands and also some bad hands in there, there's a ton of yellow hands, meaning that this range is way more merged. The abundance of yellow hands here, meaning mediocre EV hands, indicates that this range is moving towards the middle. It's condensed. It's the absolute opposite of the polarized range. So the correct answer here is simply that the small blind range is very polarized while the big blind range is very condensed. This is what happens usually in these nodes. Next question that we're asked on this slide is B, whose range do you expect to have more equity in Y before small blind bets? So to answer this, we want to go to this juncture here where the 5 of hearts river has come down, but small blind hasn't yet bet. When we look at equity, we see that small blind only has 45.8% equity, whereas big blind has 54.15%. The idea here is that the condensed range, in shedding its very worst combos and still slow playing many of its very good hands like 2-pair plus, is going to be ahead in equity, but not in nut prevalence. So this is very standard when you have one player applying tons of pressure as a better and the other player calling down. The former is going to have less equity but more nut prevalence, and the EV is going to be fairly neutralized by that. So it's fairly common for EV to be around half the pot here. The pot here is actually 400 chips here, and out of position is entitled to 188 chips. So this is neither here nor there. It's a little bit worse than half of the pot for out of position, and we can see that out of position is not suffering quite as badly in EV as they are in equity, and this is because of their nut prevalence. However, they are out of position, which kind of sucks for them. Question C, true or false, small blind shouldn't bluff here at all because he has a range disadvantage? Well, the statement is clearly false. It's true that small blind does have a range disadvantage, but never bluffing when you have a range disadvantage is absurd. It's not that you can't bluff, it's just that the average bluff in your range is not automatically winning, as it would be in a favourable world, and therefore there are many bluffs in your range that are losing. So when we look at the sim here, what we're going to see is a lot of selectivity with the small blind range, and many hands that have absolutely no showdown value electing to give up. Hands that especially like to give up here are things that contain blockers to missed flush draws and missed gutters, because these hands are actually going to be folding at the highest frequency in the big blind range here when we bet. We can see there's a lot of queen, jack, etc. folding the river there. So it's not that you can never bluff, far from it. You can bluff a lot of different hands. It's just that don't expect your bluffs to have an automatically very profitable EV. Only certain blockers will give you profitable bluffs here. Other blockers, mainly busted spade draws, are going to give you a worse outlook, and then having diamonds and hearts is the best because you unblock more of those backdoor calls that then hit 9 on the turn and then fold the river. So there's a lot going on here suits wise that we won't get into fully for now, but the idea is that you still need to find bluffs, and lots of them. When you have a lot of value bets, you just need to be careful and avoid certain obviously bad ones like the queen 8, queen 7 of spades, king 8 of spades, etc. These are all losing as bets and winning as checks with a tiny smidgen of showdown value. So that's what's happening there. And finally D, true or false, big blind should only call the river if he has 2-pair or better. Explain your answer. So again, let's head over to the solver and have a look at what they're calling against the jam here. And we can see that there is some 1-pair calling. If you only call 2-pair or better here, yes, it feels good. It's nice to have that sort of cushioning of the second pair, but you are meant to bluff catch 10-6, 10-7, a6, 1-pair hands here, even to a 2x pot shove. I think this spot is probably overfolded by humans to a very big bet, and probably to all sizes. So if you're in this spot, guys, I would recommend exploitatively that you do overbluff this situation as a small blind against most regs that play low or micro stakes, maybe even people that play 1, 2, 2, 5 live that are kind of cagier players that aren't looking to gamble too much. You definitely want to be bluffing these rivers because, yeah, you'll run into 2-pair and you will get called sometimes, but you will even see opponents make big hero folds here from time to time, and it's very unlikely to get looked at by a hand like ace-6 ever here against a kind of taggy, nitty opponent. So definitely there are a lot of opponents that you want to always bluff here, and the answer is that big blind cannot just call down 2-pair plus. We can see here there's some counterintuitive looking calls like the king 10 of spades. The idea with that hand being that the 10 is a good blocker to your value region, and you're not actually going to be bluffing the king high spade misdraw here anyway, because it's bad to bluff with in theory, so this hand isn't actually going to block your bluffing range. Question 5 is a cutoff versus big blind node. We are the big blind player here, and we're actually on the other side of the coin facing aggression now. A asks you, is it profitable, meaning better than folding? This isn't asking you what should you do. It's not saying is calling better than raising. It's just saying, is it better to call or to fold if you only had those choices with a hand like queen 9 of hearts? Why or why not? What do you guys think about this one? Let's take a look at the solver. So here we have the big blind reaction to the cutoff B75 on this turn. And we can see that while most queen 9 just being a naked gutter is folding, the queen 9 of hearts in particular is pure raising. But that wasn't the question. The question didn't ask you if you should raise queen 9 of hearts. The answer is yes, you should. It's better than calling because the EV of call is somewhat hampered by the disadvantage of being out of position and not really having the chance to bluff rivers and realize fold equity properly. However, if given the choice between call and fold, it would be a big mistake to fold This EV is being expressed in terms of chips, and one chip is effectively a tenth of a big blind. So losing the 9 chips you would pass up by not calling is akin to losing one big blind in this spot, which is quite a lot to be throwing away in a pot that's not that big yet. The Queen 9 of Hearts is a hand that you definitely want to be calling here if you're not raising, but of course the best play is raise. But what I want you guys to understand here is that due to the combination of implied odds, pair draw outs, and minimal showdown value, you do actually want to be calling this hand. Let me show you guys what happens if we call here and the river comes a brick. So equity out of position with this hand, it does show you, even though that hand isn't meant to reach this node, it does tell you that if the hand did reach this node, then it would have a check EV of about 8% pot. And that's because a non-zero percentage of the time, villain is going to be checking down a few hands that this actually chops with or beats, something like Queen 6 or something of that ilk. So you might not think it, but very minimal showdown value, there being a really rare branch of the tree where your hand actually wins without improving, is part and parcel to why calling is better than folding. Another reason for that is that you have pair draws to go with your straight draw and your flush draw as well. So it's very important not to fall victim to the don't have the odds fallacy on this node. You do actually have the odds to call in terms of EV. This hand is good enough to call with, but the problem is more so that raising is a better line and therefore calling is a mistake. For that reason, it's not a mistake because you can't call, because calling is minus EV. It's a mistake because raising is better. So it's important to always remember that poker is a comparison. You're being asked to find the best play, but it's still important to know that calling is plus EV, even though you shouldn't do it. And no, that's not a contradiction, right? We know this. Explain the effective position on the EV of calling with a draw. The idea here is that you don't get the chance to either bluff or value bet the river necessarily when you call with a draw. So when you miss with a draw here out of position, you don't get to see villain check to you and weaken their range. If you were in position and villain checked the river to you, having bet the flop in the turn, your range would be in a very favorable situation and you would be able to bluff with loads of your air, like basically everything, like sub a certain ace high here would be able to start bluffing, and bluffing at a profit, bluffing for actually useful and profitable fold equity, where the amount of fold equity is enough to make the bet inherently profitable and exceed the EV of checking comfortably, even if checking retains a bit of showdown value. But that isn't the case out of position, because you just don't get that bet opportunity when villain checks the river. Being in position, him or herself, that's the end of the hand, right? You go to showdown and your queen high just loses to some Queen 10 that gave up or some King Queen that gave up or something like that. So one of the big problems with actually calling here instead of raising, and one of the reasons why raising is correct here with this combo draw on the turn, is that when you get to showdown, you're going to lose to villain's bluffing range that's giving up. That would never be the case in position, because you'd get to make a bet and actually win the pot from those hands. The other problem is implied odds is worse out of position, because on the rivers where you get there, where you hit a queen, or better yet, a straight or a flush, and villain has the middle of their range, when they check, you don't get that chance to value bet, and they don't get the chance to make a bluff catching call. So both sides of the tree are much worse for you here out of position, both the side where you need to bet for fold equity when you miss, and also the side where you want to bet for value when you hit. C. Explain the difference in realizability between sixes and king queen. So the main idea here is that sixes is a hand that if you call the turn with it, let's imagine that we call this turn, and we go to the river, we will sometimes fold the best hand, and we will not really make any additional money for value with this hand. We won't be able to check raise or anything like that unless the river is exactly a 6. So that isn't very many cards that we can win more money on, and we will actually squander some equity here from time to time by folding when we actually have the best hand. So any hand that can earn extra money when it gets there very easily and doesn't get there often, and also folds when ahead quite often, is a hand with poor realizability. King Queen suited, on the other hand, is the sort of combo that never folds when it's the best hand, really, apart from like occasionally when it gets bluffed by like 10 high on the river or something, but it doesn't fold as the best hand as often as sixes does, and it's able to make more money on the river and realize more EV than its equity. That's part of realizability, as well as realizing more EV than you have equity, as well as having to fold and realize less. And sixes is just bad at both of those things, and King Queen is pretty good at both of those things, and therefore King Queen, regardless of the equity of these hands, the conversion rate between equity and EV, that realizability, will be way superior with King Queen of Hearts than with sixes. And D, this is an open action spot, but what is the difference in protocol in general between thinking about open action spots and thinking about end of action spots? So the answer here is that when you're calling in an open action spot, you have a list of other factors that are relevant that wouldn't be relevant in end of action spots. So when you're on the turn, this is an open action spot because you're not closing the action for the rest of the hand by calling. You still need to think about things like implied odds, realizability, future fold equity, position, that sort of thing. When you're on the river facing a bet, it doesn't matter at that point anymore whether you're in position. Your realizability is just 100% if you call, right? We're talking about realizability if you call. There are no future streets on which you would end up folding and not realizing your outs or folding the best hand. And your implied odds on the river are not so relevant either because you're just at the end of the hand. So the upshot here is that when you're in an end of action spot, you can just mathematically compute how often you think you win and compare it, at least in principle, to how often you need to win to break even. That would be the pot odds, the required equity for calling a bet, which we work out by dividing the bet into the villain's bet plus the total pot plus our bet again. And then in the open action spot, we have all these other things to think about. In other words, EV and equity become one and the same thing when we face a bet on the river in an end of action spot and we're considering just calling or folding, but they can be quite different when you're still on the turn and have that future action complicating the game tree. Okay, so those are the optimal answers for question 5. Let's move on to question 6. So in the following spots, describe your rough flop frequency. That means your global bet frequency with range and the single bet size you will use. I want you guys to be simplifying on flop to just one sizing. I'll pull up the sim for these just to show you what the solver is doing. So on King King Deuce, you want to be betting this flop really frequently as cutoff, as it's great for your range. Remember, range advantage affects bet frequency, and you want to be betting small because you lose the nut advantage in a major way here. This flop is incredibly polarizing for your opponent's range. I'll show you what I mean by looking up a sim just now. And as you can see, guys, this sim is very extreme. I haven't told the solver here that it has to bet, but it's chosen to bet everything. This is because the EV for the in-position player is incredibly high. This is actually 37 out of 55 chips, which is a lot. You can actually change the configuration of this by going to tools at the top of PIO configuration and changing it to percent pot, which is probably a bit more useful for our practices. So I'll do that just now, just to show you guys what that looks like in percent pot. And now we can see that in position is entitled to 68% of this pot in EV. So this is absolutely huge. This is colossal. And the reason this is so good is that the king is a card that generally just favors the raiser far more than the caller. The cutoff opening range is strong enough that it's fairly rich in King X. That's not the only reason though. Having a higher density of just pairs and bigger unpaired cards in general as opposed to smaller ones is just going to help. The out of position ranges more clustered around the middle right of the hand grid here, which is where you just have air. And if we look at the EV of this range, there's a lot of very bad hands here that are just having to fold all the time. And this is very demonstrative of why the out of position player is struggling and why the in position player just wants to bet and garner that huge fold equity as often as possible. The fold equity here is huge for a small bet. It's 39%, 40% pot when I'm only betting 25%. That's huge. That's 15% more fold equity than the break-even point for a complete airball hand. So really quite cool. Now, when we look at sizing, just because you have a big range advantage doesn't entail that you want to use a big bet. Big sizing is something that happens when you have tons of hands that want a really high investment ceiling, or when your opponent's range is really merged or condensed and capped. The thing is that the big blind's range here, if we look at the out of position range, is actually quite uncapped and it's incredibly polarized. Look how polarized the out of position range is. Where they have a king, they have an enormous EV. Where they have any unpaired hand, their EV is tiny, and when they have a pair, it's mediocre to bad. But that's very rare that they actually have a pair. Very few combos of the big blind's range are pocket pairs, because pocket pairs are combinatorically just less abundant. And so it's either just a king or it's nothing, and that's why it's so bad to use a big bet on King King Deuce. People don't really understand this. You hear all kinds of reasons why you should bet small here from poker annotators that don't quite grasp the theory of the game properly. And the true reason why you bet small here is that when your opponent's range has such a dichotomy to it, when it's so polarized, the big bet will simply push your opponent's continuance range dramatically towards King X, and that can just never be a good thing for your range ever, right? That can't be good for any part of your range. So hopefully this makes sense. Summary is that we bet often and we use a small sizing when we bet. We bet all the time for 1/3 pot here, or even smaller if we want. 9-8 deuce, this board is very different. This one we have a much bigger nut advantage. The big blind's range is way more merged, not polar this time, because it contains overcards that are much stronger, gut shots, backdoor draws, open-enders, 9x, 8x, pocket pair. There's just a much more of a merging effect going on here to the big blind's range. The cutoff's range by comparison is way more nutted, right, with overpairs, so less bet frequency here, but bigger sizing is going to be the prediction. And as we can see, the solver agrees. The sea of orange has now been replaced by a kind of split between green and purple, meaning big bet or check. The solver won't hate it if you force it to use the small bet instead of this big one. It won't hate it, but it will insist that you start overbetting river's 3x pot a lot and just make up for lost ground. The most intuitive way, and the way that fits with the protocol taught in the Carrot Poker School, is to just use big bets on textures like this. It makes way more intuitive sense. Don't be lazy. Don't use a small bet because it's the button that you're used to pressing at the table. Use the bet that's principled, that's theoretical, that gels with the theory that you've just invested in and have just been studying. So on 9-8 deuce here, we can see that we're splitting our range in this polarized manner. We're big betting a lot of overpairs sets, etc. We can slow play them sometimes, especially the ones that are less beneficial to bet for fold equity reasons for denial. But yeah, we're then checking the middle of our range here. It's a classic polarized strategy. The bet frequency picks up a little bit when you get down to 3s, 4s, and 5s because the bet functions as more of a hybrid of value and denial than it does with 6s, where you have a less vulnerable hand. And then obviously pure checking hands like the ace king of diamonds and things like that, which is at the middle of the road as far as your range goes. So actually quite an easy strategy to implement. Nut advantage picking up here, meaning that you just want to be playing a big bet, and range advantage being a bit less than before, meaning that you want to bet less frequently. When we look at the EV here for in position, it's no longer 68% but merely 60% pot. Still a really good spot for range, but not one that you want to go ahead and range bet. If you do use a small bet instead of a big one here, needless to say, you can bet a bit more often, but I think it's a less practical and less intuitive way to apply the theory. Jack 8-6 monotone boards are always going to be polarizing to your opponent. They're always going to create the dichotomy between hands that are incredibly powerful, like heart X or heart heart, and then hands that are just not powerful at all, like diamond, diamond, club, club, spade, 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 diamond, spade, club, diamond, spade. So basically, whenever there's 3 to a suit, your opponent is going to gain combos of really strong and really bad hands. That's going to polarize their range, and of course, when your opponent's range is more polar, your nut advantage decreases, and so does your sizing. Meanwhile, monotone boards are not fantastic for the cutoffs range in general, because what they're going to do is sort of police the situation rank of card-wise, and they're going to mean that the range advantage you'd normally have by having more overpairs and good top pair, etc., is going to get negated by the fact that both players have an even-ish amount of heart-heart in their range. So range advantage isn't going to be great here, nut advantage isn't going to be great here. We're going to see a lower bet frequency for a small sizing here would be my prediction. And the solver agrees. In this spot, we're betting our range 55% of the time, a far cry from the 100% that we were betting on the King X board, and we're using a small sizing. The solver will be quite adamant about this. It will not want to use a big bet here, and we would expect some theoretical EV loss from removing the small bet from our inputs and forcing the solver to use a big bet. This is something you would never want to do. You may see people who aren't that skilled make big bets here because they're obsessing about the times that you have one heart, but actually ranges are incredibly polarized. When we look at the big blind's range here, for example, by clicking EV out of position, we see that there's a lot of orangey and green hands here. All of the suited hands are split massively between a really dark color that means no EV at all, and a really green color, which means lots of EV. We have a few mediocre hands in this range kicking around, but they tend to be on the low orangey side rather than the yellow side. There are very few yellow hands here, meaning moderate EV hands, and therefore the big bet would just split villain's range really crudely in a way that's not advantageous. When we look at our range, we can see that it's a similar story where the EV for our range is fairly polarized as well. EV in position here returns quite a lot of dark green hands and quite a lot of orange hands too. We will note here that we don't have as polarized a range as our opponent does, and when your range is more merged because you have more mediocre hands than your opponent does, usually you want a lower sizing to be your main one. So here, the fact that we have pocket queens is not actually a reason to be going really big unless we have a heart, and even then it's not clear that a big bet's best. But queens without a heart is actually just a mediocre hand, yet you'll get an amateur poker player instinctively bet big for this with this hand, just in case you have only one heart. It's really silly to only play against your opponent's one heart hands here, but a lot of your opponents just do that and they assume it's all you have and they forget about all the times you have air, in which case they want to go smaller, and all the times you have the nuts, in which case they definitely want to go smaller. So yeah, don't bet big against ranges that are way more polarized than your own range. That's the upshot here. And finally, D is Ace 7-5 two-tone. What did you guys think about this one? Well, Ace 7-5 is an interesting sort of flop on which the ace is actually quite polarizing, right? Any big card is going to polarize the big blind's range, and so I'm pretty sure we're going to see a preference for the small bet here in the solver when given the choice between B33 and B75. The flush draw is a merging thing, so some flush draw boards can be bet a little bit bigger than rainbow boards because it does create more mediocre hands in your opponent's range, again, polarized against versus merged. And usually on Ace 7-5, it's not as good a board for your range as you would think. Like, it's an okay board, but I would predict that we want a low to moderate bet frequency here for a small sizing when we think about range and nut advantage respectively. So interestingly, the solver's a little bit torn here. It actually thinks that big bets and small bets are both fine, so I would say that you can go either way. On a flop like Ace 7-5 cutoff versus big blind, you could simplify to a polarized strategy with just a big bet, or alternatively simplify to a slightly less polarized, more merged strategy with just a small bet. One thing I would say is clear though is that you shouldn't be betting range on a board like Ace 7-5 because again the big blind player is just going to be a little bit too polarized and strong for that to be good. And when we look at his range here, we can see that again there's quite a dichotomy between really strong and really weak hands. When we look at the equity here, or EV, for in position, again it's about 60%, but this time there's a bit less usefulness from getting fold equity because the board is higher. This time when you're betting top pair, you're not getting villain to fold over cards ever, and so betting is just not as useful for denial as it was on the jack high board we looked at previously, monotone nature aside for now. Okay, so I hope you guys got quite close with that question. It's definitely a difficult thing when you first begin to get good at. And I would say there are some boards like board D here where it doesn't really matter whether you bet big or small as long as you know how to construct it. But you want to be clear about that when you set out here in poker. You want to have an idea of how you're going to be playing each of these textures, what sizing, what frequency. These are the cornerstones of your strategy. So if you can't decide on a frequency or a sizing, your range just never really gets off the ground and you can't construct at all. So definitely the first things to do: frequency, sizing, range advantage, nut advantage. Think of the big picture, then see where your hand fits into it. That'd be my advice. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so question 7 asks us a very important thing, which is to explain whether the following worlds, meaning for a whole range globally speaking, are favorable, neutral, or unfavorable. This question does a lot to the game tree. It really affects how often we can bluff, what kind of requirements we need to apply to our holding in order to decide whether it's a mandatory or optional or prohibited bluff, and also affects equity thresholds, sizing, frequency, just basically everything. So it's really important to understand favorability first before we think about a question such as the second part of question 7, which is to name the lowest equity hand you'd be allowed to bluff with in each spot. In essence, what this question is trying to do is to get you to let go of somewhat arbitrary requirements that you may have formally applied to your bluff selection, such as I need a flush draw, I need a flush blocker, I need a gut shot, and actually think about the favorability first and ask yourself, how selective does my range need to be here? Can I just use pair draws? Can I use bad gutters? Or do I have to use just like the best bluffs imaginable before you start making judgments about whether a hand is good enough or not to bluff? So let's look at hand A. In this spot, we have the chance to double barrel on 9-8 deuce king, double flush draw. We bet big on the flop. Villain checks the turn, and this is the strategy. So starting off with favorability, I've expressed this time as a percentage of the pot, and we can see that the in position EV on a card as good for us as the king is 70%. So this is probably one of the most favorable worlds you guys could ever think about. If there's a card that villain folds the most to a B75 on the flop here, it's probably actually a king. And that's because a 10, a jack, a queen, a 7, a 6, these all have straight draws a lot of the time. The king can never have a straight draw, but it's also not as big in showdown value as an ace, and it's not a pair. So the king is one of the most prominent cards in our range. It's one of our c-bet bluffs at a high frequency. Of course, we're betting a polarized range. back on the flop here. So we're going to be betting a large amount of our King X here, as you can see. Meanwhile, villain will be folding a bunch of their King X, continuing very rarely indeed, only with King Queen off with a diamond or a front door flush draw or backdoor heart draw with two big cards, and even something like King 5 of hearts has to get folded pure to the bigger bet here. Is not really doing much calling, doing any calling or raising. So this turn is a disaster for villain. Our EV is sky high, and therefore, as you can see, our bluff selection is basically non-existent. We just bluff everything. We have no criteria, no standards, there's no strictness here. So let me show you a common way in which someone could go wrong here, because the worst hands you're allowed to bluff here are literally just garbage. There's stuff like the 5-4 of clubs, right? Just anything. A way a student would go wrong here is they'd get dealt a hand like 7-6. Okay, let's say 6-5-4. Let's pick a hand that's actually hopeless, like 5-4. And they would say, I'm not going to bluff here because I could have better bluffs. This doesn't mean anything. You're not trying to compare 5-4 to 7-6 or to any flush draw. Of course, you would rather have Jack 10 than 5-4. That doesn't mean you would rather bluff with Jack 10 than 5-4. What matters is the EV difference between betting now and betting later. And you can see with 5-4 of clubs, we're actually entitled to 10% of the pot here, near enough, even though the hand is hopeless. And this is because our fold equity is going to be reasonable on this node. Villain is folding slightly more than the break-even point, and we still have the chance of hitting a 5 or a 4 and sometimes surviving. So on favourable worlds like a king, you will have so many value bets, your fold equity will be high enough that you can bet now you will not be getting raised. Super high frequency, even less so by humans, I think, than by solvers. Yes, solvers raising like 7% here. I don't even know if you get raised that often by a human, maybe about that. But yeah, it's going to be a rare guest in their strategy. And so you can bet with impunity. You just have so many value bets, so many bluffs on this node. I hope I've been clear. Don't be shy on turn cards that are really favourable for your range and position. Okay. Next up, we have the texture of 8-6 deuce flush draw turn 5. This one is clearly less favourable, right? And already we should be starting to assign some degree of selectivity. There will be a few hands now that are just too hopeless to bluff, but maybe not as many as you would think, even in a sort of neutral to unfavourable world such as this one. Let's first off start by looking at how the solver views favourability here, and then get on to the worst hand that we can bluff with, or the lowest equity hand, we should say. So there are a few notable differences here, strategically speaking. First off, the bet sizing has gone down because the nut advantage has been incinerated on this card. This is normal, it's what we'd expect from our theory so far. And our range advantage is also a lot lower when we view the EV here of the in position range. It is slightly unfavourable to neutral. I think the most apt descriptor for this spot would actually be neutral, not unfavourable. And the reason for that is that 48% is very close to neutral. Remember, it's not a race. We're not trying to just pip our opponent at the post here and be slightly ahead of them in terms of equity. If it's 52-48, I think it's closer to neutral than unfavourable, but it's getting unfavourable, and therefore we're going to have to be more selective with what we bluff on this node. What are some hands that you just simply cannot bluff with? Something like the King 4 of clubs is just rendered too bad here. Something like... we can see our pair draws are by and large okay. There aren't many pair draws here that we're not allowed to bet that have 2 overcards. Those are generally good. But when we only have 1 overcard and we have a kind of dicey hand that doesn't have a heart blocker or heart draw here, we do a lot more giving up. So one hand that really illustrates this is a hand like King 4. Another hand that might take you by surprise here is a hand like Queen 7, having an open ender here, but I think the problem is just unblocking the raising range of your opponent, getting raised. Remember, thinking back to lecture 10 and the optimal result of your bet, when your blockers unblock your opponent's bluff raises and value raises and tend to block the folding range here, you don't really want to be betting as often. So you're actually going to see some combos of like 7x open ender, just opt to realize equity here instead of betting. But yeah, overall, we're just checking back a lot of hands that people commonly bet too often with, like overpairs with a heart, for example, or just mixes. There's no compulsion to bet kings with or without a heart here. Again, don't obsess about your opponent having a draw. They have a made hand very often on this node as well. So the worst hand that we are allowed to bluff with here is going to be some kind of 2 overcard pair draw, like Queen Jack of clubs or something like that. These hands are still bettable. People forget that a pair draw is a thing, and if there's something that people get wrong here is that they undervalue just the power of being able to hit a hand that beats a pair. If you imagine that villains' pair draws here only make straights on low cards, when a queen comes on the river, if it's not the Queen of Hearts, you're going to be doing really well by hitting that queen. You're going to leapfrog all of their sub 2-pair hands, which is really powerful, right? So the weakest hand that you can bluff with here is a lot weaker than you might think before you've studied this Carrot Poker School material. King Jack 5. Deuce. So the blank turn here is clearly a lot better for your range than most turn cards would be, in the sense of nut advantage being preserved. This is not a spot where you're going to have a range advantage, but because you're in position with higher nut prevalence than your opponent's range has, you're going to have a nut advantage on this node. So you're going to use overbets here, potentially. I know I said you can simplify to a B75 here if you want as well, but the sort of trademark thing to do in game theory would be to apply overbets on this node because you have such a big nut advantage and villain's range is so capped. And the worst hand that you're allowed to bluff here again is going to be something really miserable looking. It's going to be easy to not bluff enough on nodes like this. Let's have a look at what the solver thinks about this one. So here is the strategy for 7C for the King Jack 5 Deuce. And we can see that the overbet is the weapon of choice, and the solver is not being picky at all here. It's not worried about having a weak hand on this node because it knows that the spot's favourable enough for range, that fold equity is going to be forthcoming enough. We're not going to get raised very often at all in a node like this, 6% or something like that. Even that we probably won't see from humans because they're having to slow play like King Jack on the flop just to get to this point, basically. So I don't think this happens very much. We can definitely bet with impunity here, and we can go right the way down to some really terrible looking hands like 9-7 of hearts and just bet. Are you finding that? Probably not. The chances are that you're not, because you're human, and humans are very drawn to just the linearization pitfall in general and just building way too strong of a betting range without meaning to. So it's very natural to just accidentally build a really value and high equity draw heavy range when you're barreling here, but just know that when you're doing that, your opponents are not indifferent at all and should actually be just overfolding dramatically to punish you and exploit you for this inaccuracy. And on to spot D, we have Jack 10 Deuce and the turn is a king. This is similar to hand 1, but what you'll notice about D is that the king turn is going to be much more related to the board than in hand 1. So what that means is that villain will have a bit more king X and stuff that connects with the king in general, like queen 9, ace queen here. Ace queen is not a common guess due to preflop, but big blind will have more stuff that makes 2-pair and straights on this texture because the king is related to the jack and the 10 on the flop. This is still, though, nevertheless a very good situation for the button. The ace queen prevalence preflop in button's range is really just a big advantage at the very top of ranges. And of course, hands like queen 9 and things will be raising the flop a lot from big blind's perspective and will be thus eliminated from the strategy by this point. So again, another favourable world. Again, the lowest EV hand that you can bluff is going to be shockingly low down. Let's have a look at what it is in the solver. Here we have the strategy. We can see that the betting frequency is picked up once again here for the cutoff player. Lots of betting going on now on this node, for the button player, I should say. And you have a choice of sizes. The reason that the solver is torn between two sizes here is just that the spot is nutted enough that you can use overbets, but there is still a degree of uncappedness in the out of position range here in polarization, just because the king does create some 2-pair and straight type hands. So we can see here that we're going for some, again, pretty ridiculous looking bluffs, 5-4 being a pure bet here. You just have to understand that it's not about having equity. When you're bluffing in a favorable world for your range, it doesn't matter whether you have equity. What matters is that you're betting a good array of high equity and low equity hands. There are no so-called loss leaders in GTO. There are no hands that are betting and it's bad to bet them, but they do it for the sake of the range. That's not a thing. Like, it's totally okay to bet 5-4 here. When we look at strategy EV, we can see that whether we bet or whether we check with a hand like 5-4 of clubs is really close. It's actually better to bet. And the reason for that is that you're unblocking the folding range really heavily. Villain has already folded a lot of the 5x and 4x hands on the flop here. They're already gone. So with the exception of 5s and 4s, this largely unblocks the kind of bigger to medium cards that are folding here, which are like Jack, 7, 10, that sort of ilk of hand. So the 5 and the 4 will not block a kicker to a Jack or a 10, and that's the main thing that Villain is actually folding here on the turn. So really interesting, isn't it, when you just see how solvers approach bluffing on the turn. They don't think about absolute criteria like, do I have a flush draw, do I have a straight draw? They don't build their betting range from the top down. They build it in a way that actually makes you indifferent. So when you face aggression from a fellow human, assuming I'm talking to a human here, you're going to want to overfold at low stakes because people are just not finding enough of these low equity bluffs, and they're also not slow playing enough of their good hands. So what you'll see here is that even a hand like top pair is meant to be checking like at a decent frequency. Like the average check frequency here is low for this range. So like, king 6 checking half the time, that's a lot of checking. That's a big part of the checking range. People tend to bet too much top pair, not bluff enough 5-4. The upshot is that they just have a really overprotected betting range and underprotected checking range. This is just the way it goes. I talk about this a lot in my live exploitative course that I run for my own private students. Let's move on. So question 8 asks you for the following spots to explain whether you'll be deploying a semi-polarized or fully polarized float bet strategy on the flop in position, and state the sizing that you'll be using, either B33 or B75. So this first one in a 3-bet pot, the idea here is that when small blind checks to you, small blind still has a protected range, right? They're not just checking to fold, they're checking over pairs, they're going to check raise, they're going to check raise value, check raise bluff you, everything like that. So using a big bet as button here where you don't have a relevantly large amount of nutted combos is just not going to be proper. Much better just to bet semi-frequently here because it's an okay spot for range advantage. Remember, range advantage governing frequency, nut advantage then governing sizing, and the small sizing here is going to be the thing. So question A, we're going to bet at reasonable frequency but with a small sizing. It's not going to be anything like a range bet though. This is a fairly neutral world. And as we can see, the solver tends to agree. It's betting quite often, for 50% of the time, is a fair bet for float betting actually, given that you're not the pre-flop aggressor. But because your range is so mergy, you just have a lot of mediocre hands in your value betting region, not a lot of really good hands. Sorry, that's out of position. He's anything but mergy. He's very polar. But the in-position player is very mergy, lots of lime greens, yellows, like light oranges. This range is just super merged. It just doesn't have much polarization to it at all. Contrast that to the out-of-position range, which is way more polar. Again, we see the same pattern, that the more polarized range with the nut advantage is the one using the large investments, and the depolarized range, the merged one, is the one using the small investments in this float bet spot. As we see here, when we bet, there's a ton of raising for the out of position player. So why bet big just to get raised by a polarized range? It doesn't make sense. Your main motivation for betting this flop is to get a bit of denial and thin value. Why would you want to use a big sizing when you're only doing those things and you're facing a raise so frequently? You'll still face a raise frequently even if you bet big here, by the way. Moving on. B, we have King Queen 10. So here you might want to ask yourself, when I'm float betting this spot in a 3-bet pot as button, what hands am I actually interested in betting? And the reason is, I would actually simplify to a big bet strategy here. I'm not sure if the solver will 100% agree with me, but the reason I would just do that is that I'm very happy just betting extremely strong hands. Plus here, straights 2-pair, that's really it. I don't want to bet a lot of 1-pair. Maybe King Jack is an exception, or like King plus flush draw, but I don't want to be betting just random ace queen combos here. I could if I build a small sizing. I'm not interested in doing that. Sometimes in float bet spots, the solver will be torn. This could be one of these spots where it's sort of torn, but I would definitely just bet rarely here because it's a bad spot for range and error on the side of big betting my nutted combos as value bets, and then trying to find some bluffs here will be super tricky. I'll show you guys how to do that as well when we pull up the sim imminently. Fortunately, the solver does completely agree with me this time. It's nice when that happens. I haven't looked at these. I've run all these sims before making this video, but I haven't studied them beforehand or anything. I'm just showing you through the course of this feedback that everything that you've been taught in grade 1 and everything that you're going to be taught in grades 2 and 3 of the Carrot Poker School is completely in line with game theory. This is a theoretical course, so it's good when it agrees, but I would say that there's probably some room to build this bet in without significant EV loss if you really wanted to. I wouldn't bother. I would just play this way, and as you can see, there's not a lot of betting with 1-pair. Even King Jack is being bet at a really low frequency. Hands like Ace Queen King 9 not really being bet. And then 2-pair plus and straights betting. Even some slow playing going on with a straight here at a lower SPR. When it comes to bluffing, the main candidates are actually things like overcard plus gutter ace-x, and then things like 5s or 4s with a spade. These are like functioning as bluff bets essentially on a high board where they've been decimated. Interesting stuff, makes sense, fits with what we talked about in lecture 8. C gives us the board of 7-7-6, but now we're moving to a single raise pot. In a single raise pot here, you're actually going to be doing much better. We actually looked at a board that's very similar to this in lecture 8, where we saw that the nut advantage resides with big blind here because their range is a little bit more pushed towards combos like 7x suited and even 7-8 off and stuff, 7-6 off before the flop than small blinds is. So we're going to be betting quite often here, and we're going to use a big sizing. This is going to just be a semi-polarized strategy, not a polarized one like we saw in B. And then for handy, we've seen another one in Lecture 8 very similar to this. I've posted the sims for it there. I don't think we need to explore this in detail because we've seen these so much already, but here we're going to be using, in my opinion, the easiest simplification is just, again, a big bet. It's an unfavorable spot. Use a big bet, use it infrequently, build a betting range which you're only really interested in crafting a strong value region with, where you're betting like semi-nutted stuff like top pair, good top pair plus. Check back all of your queen X, it doesn't need denial, that sort of thing. Okay, so hopefully that gels well with Lecture 8, which is quite a clear lecture, I think, and pretty formulaic in terms of how you apply it. Question 9 concerns 2 different river spots, and for each of them what we're going to do here is describe the weakest hand we can value bet for a block sizing. These are threshold practice, thinking about relative hand strength and range thresholds, range geography, like we did in Lecture 9. The highest showdown value bluff that you could use, remember in favourable worlds it is okay to bluff with some degree of showdown value because the fold equity can just make bluffing even better than checking, even though checking is plus EV. And C, a hand that is a pure check due to being too mediocre to bet. So hand number 1, we have Jack 5-3 blind versus blind. Let's start with this one and we'll answer all 3 questions via the sim. So this is what we call a double delayed c-bet opportunity. We check all the way to the river and small blind then has the chance to fire. What we should note about these spots is that they are inherently favourable for the out of position player if they're the pre-flop raiser, coming in at 55% pot share even though we don't have position. The reason for this is that we maintain our range advantage all the way through here when we check down to the river, and it's not an issue that we've checked 3 times because our opponent has also made 2 non-procedural and range capping and weakening checks. That said, capping isn't the only thing here. It's also about the fact that we just have a higher density in things like decent pairs and don't have as many low cards that just constitute total air here. So when we look at the overall strategy, we can see that the weakest hand that we can actually value bet, block bet here is going to be probably weaker than you would actually think. It comes in at about pocket 4s. This is somewhat surprising, but remember in blind versus blind nodes, when you've weakened your range this much and so is your opponent, everything gets upgraded. This is definitely like a choppy C texture. It's not a tsunami just because there's a flush present. And I think on this passive node, the flush is much less relevant than it would be in aggressively played spots because people just tend to, in theory and in practice, more so in practice, they tend to barrel flush draws, bet them on the flop, bet them on the turn, and don't have as many when they land on the river on a node like this. Even backdoor flush draws like we see here in a rainbow flop are going to get bet quite often. So a hand like 4s is an incredibly thin value bet here, and we can see when we get down to ace high the value betting ceases. We want to be very clear that 4s is a value bet by checking that the hands above it are also betting and the hands below it start checking. That's how we identify that range geographic threshold, guys. Moving back to part B, the highest showdown value bluff that we could use. Well, we are not bluffing anything like ace-x for the most part, though there is a little bit of, that's just flushes, so none there. And then with king-x, this appears to be where we start bluffing. So the highest showdown value bluff would be something like king-9. It seems like king-10 has enough EV by checking that it just elects to do that. And then king-9, king-8 are where we begin bluffing here. Estimating that point in game is tricky, but it comes down to evaluating the configuration pre-flop, the action sequence leading up to this point, and of course, mainly the texture, still late choppy C tsunami. And C, a hand that is a pure check due to being too mediocre to bet. Lots of examples of this. I would go with one like ace high is your very tiny pocket pair, or ace high is your bog standard example, or exceedingly good king high as well. Let's move on to the second texture now. Ace 776, so this one is definitely still lake in nature. It's incredibly difficult to hit this one. Moreover, the ranges that arrive here are also really wide. The main difference is that big blind's range is much tighter now. The out of position player actually has way more of a range advantage than they normally would as a pre-flop caller because they've gone ahead and strengthened and condensed by calling this flop bet here. Button's range bet, on the other hand, has done nothing to filter Button's range or increase or decrease the prevalence of hands of any type. So Button kind of gets here with a really weakened, capped, air-heavy, garbagey range, and Big Blind gets here with some standards at least. Yes, there are some air balls in Big Blind's range here, but Big Blind's range will be air-free enough that actually Big Blind has a big equity advantage and has to bluff pretty much every time here. So let's start by answering the weakest hand we could value bet for B33. So while the solver is mainly recommending that our value region uses a B75 on this node, there is still some scope for betting 33% pot as well. We can see a hand like pocket 8s especially likes doing that. And when we move down to king high and ask, can we bet any king high for value, we do actually see smidgens of king 9 and king 10 betting for value here. These hands, these lower kings, prefer to bluff catch because they're actually unblocking more of the 10x, jack x bluffing region of the opponent. But these hands that block a few bluffs like king 10, king 9 do actually decide to make a cheeky thin value bet. So technically here the answer is that king 10 of clubs is not too thin to value bet because it is doing that. But for the most part, the value bets start at pocket 8s for this sizing. The highest showdown value bluff that we could use, moving all the way down through king high, we can see that this is the checking median of the range, the part of the range that just is too mediocre to bet. Relative hand strength is good but not great. And when we get down to queen x, we can see that there's no bluffing here either, and the bluffing only begins at jack x. So the highest showdown value hand here that's actually allowed to bluff is a hand like the jack 9 of diamonds, which is lower than you might think. You may also be surprised to learn that jack 9 does again have some showdown value. It gets 5% of the pot by checking. And because this is a slightly favourable world for the out of position player, much better than it would be if it had just checked all the way to the river, of course, 52% range EV here, then we see that jack 9 is actually profitable as both a check and a bet, and it's an optional bluff. When you get down to some very low hands that will basically never win by checking, such as 9-6, it's now slightly better to bet, coming in at a slight profit. This is because if you B75, the fold equity is a little bit above the break-even point of 42.5%. So it makes sense that in that case you would want to bluff your hands with no showdown value, but hands that have a little bit are just going to be optional. This world is closer to neutral than favourable, but it's on the favourable side of neutral for the out of position player due to the flop filtering and condensing call there. Finally, we have question C, a hand that's a pure check. You could take your pick. Any king x or queen x would fit the bill for this one. Okay, let's move on to the final question of the exam. Hope you've been doing well so far, guys. If not, loads to learn. It's when either you've nailed it and you're doing well, or you can just pick up a ton of hints on how to improve. On to question 10. This one is going to be used to demonstrate the effectiveness of certain blocker patterns in determining what hands to bluff. With question A, there's also a red herring in here. Hopefully you notice that the ace-9 of diamonds is not going to be a bluff. It's just basically too good. It's mediocre, and it's ticking that box of just having good check EV, not the best blockers for bluffing anyway, but just not really qualifying as a bluff candidate in the first place due to its showdown value. We have then the choice between two 10-9 combos. Now, solvers are a little bit torn on this exact run out. In most situations, they're going to prefer betting with the spade. In this situation, the big blind range is going to contain some combos of offsuit hands as well that are going to be floating the B75, but they're usually going to be bigger ones like King Jack, King Queen with a spade, something like that. So having a big spade is going to be kind of bittersweet because we're going to block some flush draws, which is good because flush draws call or raises, but we're also going to block some of these offsuit floats from the flop as well. But by and large against humans, it's going to be better to have the 9 of spades, and this is because humans are just going to fold a flush draw almost never on the turn. They're going to raise it possibly too much in certain situations, and you're going to really want to eat up the outs of those hands as well, the times that they do call you, in order to bluff the river more successfully. So having the 10-9 with a spade is generally better. We should note though that neither of these 10-9 combos are particularly great because they both unfortunately contain the 10 of clubs. The 10 of clubs is a card that does block backdoor club floats like Queen 10, Jack 10, King 10, Ace 10 of clubs, and all of these combos are of course going to be folding on the turn. The Ace 9 of diamonds is never going to be bet. The 10-9 with the spade I think is a more successful bet in reality due to eating up outs and blocking, and the 10-9 with the club and the heart is probably one of the worst overcard combos we could consider bluffing on this neutral-ish node. Part B is about the Jack 8 deuce 6-4 on a triple barrel opportunity. When you're triple barreling, the flush draws on this sort of texture have obviously bricked, and now it becomes a good thing to not block them. So really quickly here, I don't think we even need to prove this in a sim, but the King Queen is very clearly going to be a give up. It's blocking hands that Big Blind gets the call to this point in the hand with and then release at this juncture, such as the King 10 of clubs. And hands like this, the Queen 10 of diamonds is a really nice hand to bluff river with and is going to be a mandatory bluff in most sims, and this is because you block top pair while simultaneously just unblocking the folding range here. And Queen 10 with one club is going to be a bit more optional, probably not a thing in most sims, but it's not as bad by any means as having two relevant club blockers. Do remember as well, the higher the club here, usually the more negative this blocker is actually going to become. Okay guys, I hope you've enjoyed this exam feedback. I hope it's given you a lot, and I hope that you scored well on the exam. The next thing to do is to sign up for grade 2 if you haven't done so already, and do the whole thing all over again at a more intermediate level. I hope that this course has given you the footing that you need to build your web of poker ideas, and to build it in a foundational and cohesive manner that's going to help you strengthen your game even more in the future. Do revise this course a few times. Do let us know what you think about it, and if you enjoyed it, please do spread the word that the Carrot Poker School is the way to go, and learning poker academically is a very important thing in my opinion. I hope to see you in grade 2 and grade 3. Good luck at the tables, and see you around. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.